Johannesburg, South Africa, 2005. A city glowing with the pulse of gold and greed, where men built empires with one hand and buried secrets with the other. In the middle of this web of power stood one man, Brett Kebble, mining magnate, political insider, patron of the powerful. He was the kind of man who could make or break careers with a single phone call. He moved in the highest circles, dining with politicians, investing in revolutions, and funding campaigns that shaped the nation. But on the night of September 27th, 2005, everything changed. His luxury Mercedes was found riddled with bullets on a quiet Johannesburg street. No robbery, no struggle, no sign of panic. Just a man sitting alone in the driver's seat, dead, with secrets that would shake South Africa's elite. And yet, what happened next made the crime even darker, because those who were supposed to bring justice seemed to already know too much. Was Brett Kebble murdered? Or did he orchestrate his own death to escape an empire built on lies? Did his wealth buy loyalty or seal his fate? And why, even today, does every attempt to tell his story seem to vanish under the weight of silence? Before we dive deep into this world of power, betrayal, and death, take a second to pause this video. Hit that like button, subscribe, and share this story with others who love unraveling the dark truths hidden behind wealth and politics. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to light, stories they'd rather keep buried. Now, let's go back to the night South Africa's most powerful witness vanished. The fall of a power broker. Brett Kebble was more than just a businessman. In early 2000 South Africa, his name carried weight. He was a mining magnate, a political donor, and a symbol of ambition in a country redefining itself after apartheid. But beneath the polished surface of success, there was a darkness, a growing network of debt, deceit, and betrayal that would eventually cost him everything. Born into privilege, Kebble was the son of a respected mining engineer. He had the education, the access, and the confidence to navigate both the boardroom and the backroom. In a nation hungry for transformation, he positioned himself as the bridge between old wealth and new power, a man who could make deals happen where others couldn't. By 2005, Kebble had everything: money, status, and political influence. He funded the African National Congress Youth League, supported up-and-coming leaders, and moved through Johannesburg's elite circles like a man who owned the city. But behind the charm and champagne, something was unraveling. Rumors began to swirl. Missing funds, unpaid loans, suspicious transfers. His empire, it seemed, wasn't built on gold, but on shifting sand. Banks grew nervous. Partners grew distant. And enemies began to close in. Kebble's once loyal associates were turning against him, whispering in corridors about mismanagement and manipulation. To outsiders, he remained untouchable. But inside his company, cracks had become canyons. His most trusted aides began to fear what might come next. Some believed he was planning a comeback. Others thought he was cornered. And then came the whispers that Brett Kebble knew something too dangerous to reveal, something that could bring down more than just his company. By September of that year, the walls were closing in. Financial investigations were underway. The press had begun circling. Former allies were preparing to testify. And Brett Kebble, the man who once seemed untouchable, started to realize that power, like gold, can crumble under pressure. In the days leading up to his death, friends said he appeared anxious but oddly calm. He made quiet calls, attended meetings that were never recorded, and confided in people he hadn't spoken to in years. Some described it as a man putting his affairs in order. Others said it felt like he was preparing for something far more calculated. On the night of September 27, 2005, Brett Kebble left his home in Melrose, Johannesburg, driving alone in his silver Mercedes-Benz. Hours later, his body was found slumped behind the wheel, shot several times, yet with no sign of robbery or struggle. His expensive watch still on his wrist, his wallet untouched. It was not a random act of violence. It was precise, controlled. And as the investigation began, one truth became clear. Brett Kebble's death was not just a murder. It was a message. Who sent that message, and why? would send shockwaves through South Africa's business and political elite, exposing a tangled web of deception that reached the highest levels of power. Web of corruption. The investigation into Brett Kebble's murder began with confusion and contradiction. Johannesburg police initially treated it like a high-profile assassination. The body of a millionaire, shot multiple times, found in his car. The media rushed to frame it as a hit, a calculated execution meant to silence a man who had crossed the wrong people. But behind the flashing cameras, detectives were struggling to piece together what actually happened that night. The first surprise came from inside Kebble's own circle. Those closest to him didn't seem shocked, not entirely. They spoke carefully, as if measuring every word. His business partners expressed grief, but their stories didn't align. Some said he had been receiving threats. Others claimed he was under enormous pressure from creditors. A few hinted that Kebble had been preparing for something far darker than anyone imagined. As police traced his final hours, the mystery deepened. Kebble's phone record showed calls to several powerful individuals, businessmen, politicians, even a few with alleged ties to organized crime. The timeline was tight, but something didn't fit. No one could explain why he had been driving alone through Melrose that night, or who he was planning to meet. Detectives soon learned that Kebble's empire was collapsing faster than anyone realized. His companies were buried in debt, his financial records were incomplete, and millions had gone missing. His once loyal allies were abandoning him. He owed favors to dangerous men, men who didn't forgive easily. The police began to suspect that Kebble's death might not have been a murder for hire in the traditional sense. Instead, it looked like something else, a deal gone wrong, or even worse, a crime he might have orchestrated himself. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered shocking details. Kebble's private security team had been reduced weeks before his death. Several of his closest associates had disappeared or left the country. And one chilling piece of evidence surfaced, a report suggesting that Kebble had discussed a final act with a former associate, an act that would make him a martyr and leave behind a fortune protected from seizure. The theory was wild. Could Brett Kebble have arranged his own death? The idea seemed absurd, yet the evidence pointed that way. The bullets used were traced back to an underworld figure linked to Kebble's business dealings. Several suspects arrested claimed they were paid not to murder him, but to assist him in staging a fatal scene. If true, it would mean that South Africa's most powerful businessman had paid for his own assassination, a desperate attempt to escape disgrace, debt, and prosecution. But there was one problem. Too many people benefited from his death. His companies were quickly taken over. His political connections dissolved in silence. And those who might have known the full truth suddenly stopped talking. It was clear that this case wasn't just about Brett Kebble. It was about everyone around him, people who stood to gain power, money, or freedom from his disappearance. And as the truth began to surface, so did a terrifying question. Who killed Brett Kebble? And who helped him die? The puppeteers behind the curtain. The murder of Brett Kebble should have been a straightforward case. A businessman shot dead in the heart of Johannesburg, a city where power and greed often collided in public view. But by the third week of investigation, what began as a criminal inquiry was morphing into something much darker. The police weren't just chasing a killer anymore. They were unraveling a web of influence that reached deep into South Africa's corporate and political elite. Brett Kebble wasn't just another tycoon. He was a man who knew how to buy loyalty and silence. For years, he had used his wealth to fund political campaigns, sponsor lavish lifestyles, and secure immunity from scrutiny. He surrounded himself with individuals who owed him, not just money, but allegiance. And now, those same individuals were quietly reshaping the story of his death. It started with the lawyers. Within days of his murder, Kebble's legal team moved to seal key business documents and financial records. Court injunctions were filed at lightning speed, blocking investigators from gaining access to critical ledgers. One detective later admitted that the paperwork moved faster than the police ever could. Then came the political connections. Members of parliament, business magnates, and even a few high-ranking government officials began issuing carefully worded statements. Each expressed sorrow, but none demanded justice. It was as if everyone had silently agreed that Brett Kebble's death was a tragedy best left unexplored. Behind the scenes, investigators were being pressured to close the case quickly. Leads were dismissed as unreliable. Witnesses were suddenly unavailable. Funding for forensic tests was cut. The detectives who refused to comply found themselves reassigned or transferred out of the task force. Still, a handful of stubborn officers refused to let it go. They followed the money, and where the money went, the truth began to flicker in the shadows. A trail of payments led to a series of shell companies, ghost entities that existed only on paper, each tied back to Kebble's mining empire. Through them, millions have flowed into the pockets of politicians, law enforcement officials, and influential businessmen. These weren't random payouts. They were insurance policies, favors bought in advance for a day exactly like this one. As the pieces came together, one name surfaced again and again: Glenn Agliotti, a notorious underworld figure known as the landlord for his control over Johannesburg's illicit trade networks. Agliotti had connections to Kebble's world, both in business and in backroom dealings. He wasn't just a casual acquaintance. He was part of the machinery that kept Kebble's empire running. When Agliotti was finally brought in for questioning, the story took an even more surreal turn. He didn't deny knowing Kebble. In fact, he claimed they were close friends. But what shocked investigators was his statement. Brett Kebble, he said, had asked for his help in arranging his own death. According to Agliotti, the plan wasn't murder. It was a mercy job. Kebble wanted to escape prosecution and protect his assets. The death was meant to look violent enough to distract everyone from his financial crimes. But somewhere along the way, control slipped, and what was supposed to be a stage scene became a fatal act. It was the most bizarre confession investigators had ever heard. Was Agliotti telling the truth, or was he spinning a narrative to protect others? The powerful hands that had orchestrated everything from behind closed doors? Public reaction was explosive. Newspapers ran headlines about the assisted suicide of a millionaire. Talk shows debated whether it was tragedy or treason. But beneath the noise, one fact remained clear. If Agliotti was involved, he wasn't acting alone. Witnesses described secret meetings in Santon penthouses. Men in expensive suits discussing damage control. Files disappearing from offices overnight. Calls traced to politicians who had no official reason to be in contact with Agliotti or Kebble's associates. And then came the most damning revelation. One of the very detectives assigned to Kebble's murder case was found to have received money through one of Kebble's shell accounts, weeks before the murder. The lines between law enforcement and corruption blurred completely. It wasn't just a case of who killed Brett Kebble anymore. It was about who allowed him to die and why so many people wanted the truth buried. By the time the dust began to settle, one thing was undeniable. Brett Kebble had built his life on control. Yet in death, control had passed to others, to the puppeteers who now pulled the strings of silence, rewriting history for their own survival. And in that silence, Johannesburg held its breath, waiting for the next revelation, the one that could finally expose the full machinery of betrayal. Confessions, immunity, and the courtroom chaos. The story of Brett Kebble's death had already twisted itself into a knot of corruption and deceit, but Chapter 4 is where that knot began to tighten, threatening to strangle everyone involved. When Glenn Agliotti's name became public, it sparked shockwaves across South Africa. The idea that a respected businessman had died in what could have been a planned assisted suicide seemed too absurd to be true. Yet, in the chaos that followed, the absurd became believable. As investigators dug deeper, the case spiraled from a homicide into a scandal, one that exposed not just criminal intent, but a system built on favors, fraud, and silence. It all began when prosecutors offered a deal. In exchange for full cooperation and truthful testimony, Agliotti and several others were promised immunity from prosecution. On paper, it was meant to help the state identify everyone involved in Kebble's death. In reality, It was a gamble, trading justice for confessions in a system already polluted by influence. And then, the floodgates opened. One by one, the men tied to the conspiracy began to speak. First was Mikey Schultz, a well-known figure in Johannesburg security and underworld circles. Then came Nigel McGurk and Faisal Cappy Smith, both ex-bodyguards turned hired guns. Their stories aligned almost too perfectly. According to their testimony, Brett Kebble had indeed orchestrated his own death. He was drowning in debt, facing massive financial exposure, and cornered by investigations that could destroy his empire. They claimed Kebble approached Schultz directly with a chilling request to end it cleanly in a way that would look like a random hit. They even described practice runs, driving routes, lighting conditions, escape paths. Every detail rehearsed, every angle calculated. On the night of September 27, 2005, it was all executed, just as planned. Schultz said Kebble sat calmly in his car, lights dimmed, window slightly rolled down. He wasn't ambushed, he was waiting. When the first shot rang out, he didn't scream or resist. It was over in seconds. The confessions shocked the nation. South Africans listened in disbelief as hitmen calmly described being paid, not to kill a man against his will, but to fulfill his own fatal request. It was a story so outlandish it split the public in two. Those who believed Kebble had orchestrated his own downfall, and those who suspected this was yet another layer of cover-up. But what truly sent outrage through the country wasn't the murder itself. It was what happened next. The confessed killers, thanks to their immunity deals, walked free. They were never convicted for their roles in the killing. In exchange for turning state witness, they became untouchable. To many, it was a betrayal of justice, a message that power and negotiation could bend the law until right and wrong no longer mattered. Meanwhile, Glenn Agliotti, the man prosecutors initially painted as the mastermind, was standing trial for Kebble's murder. His defense was simple. I didn't kill Brett Kebble. He wanted to die. In an explosive courtroom moment, the hitmen themselves testified for Agliotti. They confirmed his version of events. They swore under oath that Agliotti wasn't there that night, and that he had acted as a go-between. Nothing more. The state's case fell apart in spectacular fashion. Contradictions piled up. Evidence was ruled inadmissible. Witnesses recanted or forgot. Files were missing. Key investigators were mysteriously reassigned just before trial. When the verdict came, Glenn Agliotti was acquitted, free to walk out of court, smiling. For the public, the message was clear. A man had died, millions had vanished, and no one would be held accountable. But beneath the chaos, something far darker was brewing. A quiet war had begun between factions of power, business, politics, and organized crime, all desperate to keep their connections to Kebble buried. Some saw his death as closure. Others saw it as a beginning. Journalists who covered the trial began receiving anonymous tips, hints about offshore accounts, encrypted transactions, and files that never saw the light of day in court. Some of those reporters later spoke of being followed, their calls monitored, their stories mysteriously pulled from publication before reaching print. Even among law enforcement, whispers circulated that Kebble's death wasn't just about debt or despair. It was about control. A message sent through violence that certain secrets in Johannesburg were too costly to expose. The line between justice and conspiracy had never been thinner. By the end of the trial, South Africa was left with a haunting paradox. Brett Kebble's killers confessed, yet walked free. His alleged conspirator stood trial, yet was acquitted. And the man at the center of it all, the one who might have tied it all together, was dead, leaving behind questions that would outlive every verdict. In death, Brett Kebble had become what he had always been in life: untouchable, unpredictable, and surrounded by mystery. Friends, betrayal, and the crumbling empire. When the courtroom lights dimmed and the verdict was read, many thought the story of Brett Kebble had finally reached its end. But in truth, the real drama was only beginning, outside the courtroom, in the boardrooms, back alleys, and whispered conversations of those who once called him friend. Because when a man like Kebble falls, he doesn't fall alone. He drags with him the people, the money, and the power that fed his rise and his ruin. In the months following the trial, Johannesburg's business elite began quietly retreating from the chaos. Companies that once flaunted their association with Brett Kebble now scrambled to erase his name from their ledgers and their memories. Partnerships dissolved overnight. Board members resigned without explanation. Private jet schedules were changed. The Kebble empire, once estimated to control billions in mining assets, had become radioactive. Among those who'd benefited most from Kebble's golden years were men who now fought to survive his legacy: politicians, brokers, even members of law enforcement. Each had a stake in ensuring certain truths stayed buried. Each feared being the next one exposed. Behind the scenes, betrayal became currency. Former allies began trading secrets for protection, testimony for freedom, and loyalty for silence. It started with John Stratton, a close associate and confidant of Kebble, whose name surfaced repeatedly in the investigation. Stratton had been instrumental in managing Kebble's vast network of shell companies, the same web through which millions had mysteriously disappeared before the tycoon's death. But when prosecutors turned their attention to him, Stratton vanished. Some claimed he fled to Australia. Others whispered that he'd been taken care of. To this day, no one truly knows. Meanwhile, the hitmen Schultz, McGurk, and Smith began showing up at exclusive clubs and events, acting like celebrities rather than confessed killers. Their newfound fame, combined with their immunity, infuriated the public. Talk shows debated their motives. Radio callers demanded to know how men who admitted to killing someone could now be giving paid interviews about it. And then came the journalists, investigative reporters, many of whom had covered the Kebble saga from the beginning, started piecing together new evidence that hinted at layers of corruption reaching far beyond one man's death. Bank transactions, property transfers, unexplained donations to political campaigns. Every lead pulled them closer to a conclusion that was as disturbing as it was dangerous. Brett Kebble's murder might have been the cleanest solution to a problem too messy for the powerful to fix any other way. One anonymous source claimed there was a meeting weeks before Kebble's death involving figures from government and law enforcement. The topic? Damage control. The implication was chilling, that Kebble's assisted suicide may have been a way to silence a man who had become a liability to too many people at once. By now, whispers of Project Kebble began to circulate, an alleged covert operation to erase evidence of financial crimes that could implicate multiple high-level officials. No documents were ever found, and no one would go on record. But the mere existence of a rumor was enough to unsettle the public and terrify those who might know too much. Among those shaken was John Stratton's attorney, who mysteriously resigned and left South Africa days before a scheduled interview with investigators. His home was found empty, his office files shredded. He was never heard from again. For the families of those entangled in Kebble's world, life had become unbearable. Anonymous calls at night, cars following them home. Reporters camped outside their gates. One widow of a former associate described it simply. After Brett died, it wasn't over. It was like something dark had been set free. Even those who testified for the state began second-guessing their safety. Rumors of surveillance, blackmail, and hush money spread through the city. People spoke of late-night meetings in hotel rooms, envelopes of cash, and threats disguised as advice. To the public, it seemed like the Kebble story was disintegrating into a web of paranoia. But to those close to the case, it was all part of a pattern, a system designed to protect itself at any cost. Through all of this, Brett Kebble's name continued to haunt South Africa. He had been a symbol of ambition, corruption, and collapse, a man whose charm could move mountains, but whose greed could bury nations. And even in death, his influence stretched across the living like an invisible hand. The newspapers called it the Kebble effect, a ripple that spread through politics, business, and society long after his body was laid to rest. By the end of 2006, multiple investigations had been quietly shelved. Files were sealed for national interest. and those who still dared to dig were met with silence, or worse. In private, one detective put it best. "We didn't solve the Kebble case. We just stopped asking the wrong questions." As 2007 approached, South Africa was left with a bitter truth. Brett Kebble may have been dead, but the machinery that built him was still very much alive and thriving. Whistleblowers, shadows, and the price of truth. By 2007, the Kebble case had evolved from a murder investigation into something far more treacherous, a sprawling maze of lies, hidden files, and silenced voices. Officially, the case was closed. Unofficially, no one truly believed it. Journalists who once covered the story casually were now receiving late-night calls warning them to move on. Some complied. Others refused and paid the price. One of those who refused was Manla Peterson, an investigative reporter for the Star, who had spent nearly 2 years tracing the flow of Kebble's missing millions. He discovered connections between Kebble's companies and political donations that didn't appear on any official register. Just weeks after sharing his findings with a trusted colleague, Manla's car was found abandoned along a dirt road outside Pretoria. His laptop and phone were gone. The police called it a robbery, but his wallet was still in the glove compartment. He was never seen again. Manla's disappearance sent shockwaves through South Africa's media community. Reporters began encrypting their communications, meeting sources in secret, and refusing to go on record about anything related to the Kebble affair. One editor would later admit in a documentary interview, "We weren't just afraid of losing our jobs. We were afraid of losing our lives." And it wasn't only journalists who vanished. 2 financial auditors, assigned to review Kebble's companies after his death, both died under suspicious circumstances. One from a supposed heart attack, though he was only 39, and another from a car crash on an empty highway. The public was told it was coincidence, but those inside the system whispered that someone was cleaning house. Meanwhile, Gavin Hartley, a former bodyguard for one of Kebble's associates, came forward claiming he had documents that could blow the case wide open. He reached out to a local television producer, saying he feared for his safety. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday. Gavin never arrived. Days later, his burnout car was found near an abandoned mine shaft in Limpopo, the same province Kebble once invested millions in. Whatever he knew, it never saw daylight. As fear spread, a strange pattern began to emerge. Anyone who got too close to the truth either disappeared, withdrew from public life, or suddenly changed their story. One insider from a national prosecuting authority even confessed, off camera, "We wanted justice. But this case, it was like quicksand. The harder you pushed, the deeper you sank." And yet, there were those who refused to back down. Samantha Makona, a young journalist from Cape Town, took up the trail where others had left off. Her focus wasn't the money or the politics, it was the people. She interviewed families of those who died or vanished after Kebble's murder. She built a timeline connecting over a dozen coincidental deaths, all within 3 years of his killing. Her conclusion was chilling. This wasn't about covering up a murder. It was about protecting an empire. Samantha's articles began circulating online, shared by thousands. Her bravery reignited public outrage and forced Parliament to reopen discussions around corporate corruption and political influence. For a brief moment, it seemed like the truth might finally emerge. But then came the break-in. Her apartment was ransacked, her hard drive stolen, her notes burned in a trash bin behind her building. Nothing else was taken. Not her TV, not her cash, not her passport. The message was clear: stop. Samantha fled the country a week later. She now lives in exile, occasionally speaking through encrypted online forums, still demanding answers. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer the picture became. Brett Kebble had been a symptom, not the disease. His death was merely one thread in a much larger tapestry of corporate greed, political manipulation, and moral decay that ran through South Africa's elite circles like poison in a vein. By 2008, several witnesses had vanished. Those who remained alive did so by keeping silent. The story had morphed into something even more sinister. Not just the murder of a man, but the systematic erasure of anyone who dared question how or why he died. One investigator described it best. It was like watching ghosts erase each other. But even in the silence, there were whispers of a secret ledger hidden in a private bank, of coded emails between executives, and of one final witness, the man who claimed to know exactly who ordered the hit on Brett Kebble and why. That man's name was Peter Venner, and his sudden reappearance in 2009 would set in motion the most explosive chapter of all. Peter Venner and the revelations that shook Johannesburg. As the years passed since Brett Kebble's death, the case had taken on the appearance of a ghost story. Mysterious disappearances, vanished files, and witnesses who seemed to evaporate into thin air. Yet in 2009, one name emerged from the shadows: Peter Venner, a former associate of Kebble who claimed to know the truth behind the killing. Venner's reappearance caused an immediate stir. He reached out to investigative journalists and a few trusted detectives, claiming that he had been in hiding for fear of his life. He insisted that he could reveal who orchestrated Kebble's death, the role of each accomplice, and how corruption had allowed it to happen. But even before the full details were shared, the tension was palpable. Johannesburg seemed to hold its breath. This was a man who had vanished from public view for 4 years, and now he was ready to speak. According to Venner, Brett Kebble's death was far from a simple assisted suicide or the result of a desperate act. It was a meticulously planned operation involving multiple layers of protection for the perpetrators. Some layers were financial, others political, and some existed purely as threats of violence against anyone who might reveal the truth. Venner claimed that Agliotti, while involved, was not the mastermind. Instead, a network of businessmen and politicians, threatened by exposure of their financial dealings and investment fraud, orchestrated the operation. Kebble's assisted death was, in essence, a cover story, a smokescreen to divert attention from those who truly controlled the flow of power and money. The revelations stunned investigators. Venner provided documents, encrypted emails, and phone records, all pointing to meetings in private offices and hotels where deals had been made in secret. Each document seemed to confirm that the narrative given in court was incomplete at best, intentionally misleading at worst. What was perhaps most chilling was Venner's insistence that the system itself was complicit. Many of the law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and financial regulators involved had received payments, favors, or other incentives to look the other way. Every attempt to uncover the truth had been systematically blocked. But before Venner could fully testify publicly, whispers began circulating that he, too, was being watched. Journalists reported anonymous calls warning him to stay silent. Friends who had offered him shelter suddenly claimed they could no longer keep him safe. In March of 2010, Peter Venner disappeared again. This time, there were no clues, no sightings, no messages. His sudden vanishing reignited public speculation. Had he been silenced? Had the same network that controlled the narrative around Brett Kebble's death moved to remove yet another key witness? For the journalists and investigators who had been following him, the message was unmistakable. The deeper you go, the more dangerous it becomes. Even so, Venner's brief revelations were enough to shake Johannesburg's elite. Questions were raised about the integrity of those in positions of power. Corporate boards were quietly investigated. Certain political offices faced scrutiny, and a number of Kebble's former allies found themselves under pressure to explain their roles in his empire. Yet, despite all of this, a fundamental truth remained. The full story of Brett Kebble's death and the network of corruption surrounding it might never be completely revealed. The city had been shown how easily power could shield criminals, manipulate the law, and silence witnesses. By the end of 2010, those who had survived the scandal were left with one shared realization. The death of Brett Kebble was only the beginning. The empire of secrecy he was entangled with continued to thrive, operating in plain sight. And for the ordinary citizens who had followed the case, the lesson was grim. Wealth, influence, and a meticulously constructed network could make the truth vanish just as easily as a man. The unraveling of the empire. By 2010, The shockwaves from Brett Kebble's death and Peter Venner's brief revelations had settled into a quiet tension across Johannesburg. While the public debated the morality, legality, and intrigue surrounding Kebble's murder, behind closed doors, his empire was slowly crumbling. The first sign of the unraveling came from the financial sector. Auditors, long pressured to overlook discrepancies in Kebble's companies, began to push back. Offshore accounts that had been carefully concealed began to surface. Millions of dollars, once thought untouchable, were traced through shell companies and hidden investments. It wasn't just about money. The revelations highlighted a systemic network of corruption, connecting politicians, corporate executives, and law enforcement officials. Many had benefited from Kebble's empire, either through kickbacks, insider deals, or outright fraud. The stakes were enormous, and those implicated began maneuvering to protect themselves. Meanwhile, the media spotlight intensified. Investigative journalists compiled exhaustive reports on Kebble's dealings, tracing transactions and exposing the hidden beneficiaries. Stories emerged about financial empires built on manipulation, intimidation, and bribery. But even as these truths came to light, some of the most critical information remained elusive. Several key witnesses vanished, reminiscent of Peter Venner's disappearance. Others recanted testimony, perhaps out of fear or perhaps because of lucrative bribes. Among those who were left, a pattern emerged. Kebble's empire had been built to protect itself at all costs, even beyond the life of its founder. Those who profited the most were often the quietest. Anonymous shareholders, offshore investors, and executives operating behind layers of legality. The pressure wasn't only financial. Corporate boards were shaken by internal conflict. Executives who had once aligned themselves with Kebble found themselves in hostile takeovers, legal disputes, and boardroom battles. Companies changed hands overnight. Mergers collapsed. Partnerships disintegrated. Even politically, the reverberations were felt. Several officials, previously beneficiaries of Kebble's influence, faced scrutiny. Their careers were threatened, and some quietly resigned. Others remained, carefully recalibrating their public personas to survive. It became clear that Brett Kebble's death wasn't an ending. It was a trigger, a domino that had set the empire of secrecy, influence, and greed into a slow-motion collapse. Amidst the chaos, public fascination grew. South Africans followed each revelation with a mixture of horror and intrigue. Every leaked document, every new confession, every vanished executive reminded the nation that wealth and influence could both protect and destroy. Yet, even as the empire unraveled, there were pockets of continuity. Some businesses continued to profit in silence. Some officials remained untouchable. And some of Kebble's most enigmatic associates still moved behind the scenes, untouched by legal or financial scrutiny. The lesson was clear. Money and power could survive even the most shocking scandal. And sometimes the truth, no matter how damning, could be hidden behind layers of manipulation. As the dust settled, investigators and journalists alike faced the same sobering reality. Uncovering the full story would require courage, persistence, and a willingness to confront forces that preferred secrecy and obedience over accountability. Chapter 9 would delve deeper into the political implications of the Kebble case, exploring how the murder and the ensuing chaos reshaped alliances, threatened careers, and revealed the extent of corruption in both the corporate and governmental arenas. Political shadows and hidden alliances. By 2011, the ripple effects of Brett Kebble's murder had reached far beyond Johannesburg's business world. It was no longer simply a corporate scandal or a high-profile killing. It had become a political earthquake. South Africa's political landscape had been subtly intertwined with Kebble's empire for years. Donations to campaigns, personal loans to influential figures, and discreet financial favors had created a network of obligation and control. His death threatened to expose these connections, and those in power moved swiftly to contain the fallout. Investigators uncovered meetings between politicians and Kebble's close associates, held in luxury hotels and private offices. These gatherings were ostensibly about business strategy, but phone records, emails, and testimony suggested far more sinister purposes, coordinating narratives, influencing investigations, and ensuring that certain truths never reached the public eye. The political ramifications were profound. Several officials were quietly removed from positions of influence. Committees investigating corporate governance were stalled. Investigative journalists faced increasing pressure. Some were threatened with lawsuits. Others were followed or harassed. The message was unmistakable: stay away from Kebble's network. Meanwhile, whistleblowers continued to emerge. Anonymous letters, tips, and documents were sent to newspapers and law enforcement agencies. They detailed illicit financial dealings, bribery, and personal favors exchanged for silence. Each revelation made it clear that Kebble's murder was not an isolated event, but rather a piece of a larger puzzle involving corruption at multiple levels of power. One particularly shocking revelation involved a high-ranking government official whose name appeared in offshore account records linked to Kebble's empire. While no criminal charges were ultimately filed, the political embarrassment forced this official into a quiet resignation, signaling the fragility of alliances built on secrecy. At the same time, public protests and media campaigns demanded accountability. South Africans were growing impatient with the sense of impunity that had surrounded Kebble's death. Yet, despite growing scrutiny, key figures remained shielded by layers of legal and financial protection. For those investigating the case, this became a delicate balance, uncovering the truth without becoming the next target. Every lead, every confession, every document carried risk. One journalist, speaking under anonymity, described the situation as a high-stakes chess game. You make a move, and the board shifts. You reveal one piece of truth, and suddenly, 10 others are threatened or removed. It's a game you can't win without losing something. Amid this tension, the focus began to shift back to Kebble's inner circle. Former business partners and executives, once united in protecting his legacy, started turning on one another. Greed, fear, and self-preservation drove wedges into relationships that had lasted decades. Boardroom betrayals, secret agreements, and quiet blackmail became the norm. Individuals who had once been loyal to Kebble were now exposed as opportunists, manipulating outcomes to their benefit while hiding their hands from investigators. Even as the empire's structure began to collapse, its influence persisted. Politicians, journalists, and business leaders were forced to navigate a delicate environment where truth, loyalty, and survival were constantly at odds. Next episode revealed a stark reality. In South Africa, power could protect, silence, and manipulate, even after death. The consequences of Brett Kebble's murder had extended far beyond the man himself. They had exposed an intricate web of political, corporate, and personal interests that would continue to shape Johannesburg for years to come. Chapter 10 would examine the final unraveling of Kebble's business empire, the last attempts to cover tracks, and the hidden players who profited most while justice remained elusive. The final collapse of the empire. By 2012, the remnants of Brett Kebble's empire were crumbling under their own weight. The complex web of companies, offshore accounts, and hidden assets that had once made him untouchable was now unraveling, layer by layer. The first cracks appeared in the corporate sector. Executives who had once thrived under Kebble's leadership found themselves entangled in lawsuits, audits, and internal investigations. Several companies faced insolvency as mismanaged funds and fraudulent transactions were exposed. Banks demanded accountability for millions in untraceable deposits, and shell companies once used to obscure Kebble's finances began to collapse. The public learned that some of Kebble's closest allies had siphoned millions in the chaos following his death. While many remained technically legal under the complex financial structures, the ethical and social implications were undeniable. At the same time, political fallout continued. Officials implicated in the scandal quietly resigned or shifted roles to avoid scrutiny. Investigations into campaign contributions, tax evasion, and corruption intensified. Yet, despite the growing body of evidence, few faced real consequences. Journalists covering the story documented a chilling pattern. Those who profited most from Kebble's empire often remained in the shadows, while those who attempted to seek justice were intimidated, discredited, or disappeared. It was a stark reminder of how influence and money could manipulate outcomes. Meanwhile, the court of public opinion was unforgiving. South Africans debated whether justice had been served, and the nation's trust in corporations and politicians eroded further. Brett Kebble, even in death, remained a symbol of both ambition and the corruption that power could cultivate. Financial investigators discovered hidden offshore accounts, revealing that millions had been moved to private trusts overseas. These accounts, once controlled indirectly by Kebble, were now in the hands of a few carefully chosen beneficiaries. Each transaction, meticulously structured, ensured that the flow of money remained largely untouchable. Inside Johannesburg's corporate boardrooms, tension and paranoia ran high. Former allies, fearing exposure or financial loss, began to turn on each other. Meetings were held in secret, documents were shredded, deals were quietly renegotiated. The collapse of the empire wasn't violent, but it was ruthless, a slow dismantling guided by fear, greed, and survival instinct. Among the casualties were longtime friends of Kebble, whose reputations were tarnished even as they attempted to distance themselves from the scandal. Lawyers, auditors, and executives who had once served the empire found themselves under scrutiny. Many chose silence over truth, recognizing that the consequences of exposure could be personal, financial, or even life-threatening. Despite this, a few brave journalists persisted, tracing the money and the connections. Their reporting illuminated the reach of Kebble's influence, exposing the intricate ties between business, politics, and organized networks that had profited from secrecy and deception. By the end of Chapter 10, it was evident. Brett Kebble's death had set in motion a chain of events that reshaped Johannesburg's corporate and political landscapes. His empire no longer existed as it once had, but its influence lingered in hidden accounts, compromised officials, and a culture of power that enabled the murky dealings to continue. Chapter 11 would focus on the remaining loose ends, the final witnesses, mysterious disappearances, and unresolved questions that kept the story alive in public memory, leaving the city haunted by what was known and terrified by what might never be revealed. The last witnesses and the lingering shadows. Even as Brett Kebble's financial empire collapsed and political intrigue deepened, a handful of witnesses remained, individuals who had seen, heard, or understood too much. Their existence kept the story alive, even as time and fear worked to erase the truth. Among these was Annelies van der Merwe, a former financial advisor who had managed secret accounts on behalf of Kebble and his associates. She held key documents that could have revealed the full extent of offshore transfers, undisclosed donations, and the identities of those who profited most. Annelies lived in constant vigilance. Her phone was never left unattended, and she changed her routines frequently. Yet she knew that revealing what she knew could destabilize careers, businesses, and even governments. Still, she quietly began to provide information to trusted journalists, her identity carefully protected. Then there was Riaan Botha, a former security consultant, who claimed he had first-hand knowledge of meetings orchestrated to manipulate evidence after Kebble's death. Botha's testimony, if made public, would have confirmed the complicity of multiple officials in concealing the true nature of the murder and the empire's financial dealings.